Have you ever matched up against someone on Fightcade and they're doing a bunch of random stupid moves, and at first you think, is this guy trolling me right now? But then as the match goes on, you realize, oh, he just has no idea what he's doing. That's Tekken 8. That is my experience with Tekken 8 since its launch last year, where when it first came out, I think everyone else assumed, okay, Namco, you're making all of these strategic concessions here to try to appeal to a big mainstream audience, to try to pick up even more Street Fighter crossover. You're going to add in meter, so we got the heat. You're going to add in chip damage. You're going to try to make the game more spammy and aggressive for the guy that never wants to learn how to sidestep or backdash. And speaking of, they'll go ahead and nerf the movement, beef up the tracking a bit, and we're going to get kind of this even more watered down version of Tekken 7. That, I think, is what we all sort of figured Namco were up to. But you would think what would happen after that is once the game comes out, once it gets its 9 out of 10 from IGN and everyone's saying how great it is and it's getting its sales, it has its install base, it's getting its competitive scene all set up, then you would think that Namco would then start to tune the game into a more competitive experience for the long term. But last year, it was just disaster after disaster. I have this whole video recapping this recently called Tekken's Authenticity Crisis, if you want to hear all about that. But I think what everyone were hoping, I know I was hoping coming into Season 2 was, all right, this is where they pull it together. This is where the game is now actually going to become a real game. It's not just going to continue this awful madness. But oh boy, Namco had a surprise in store. Because now it is obvious that beyond just the intention of modernizing Tekken, they also do not have the developer talent to back up this vision. This goes way beyond just hoping that they'll change their mind and make the game good. Season 2 has revealed their hand that they don't know how Tekken works. Even if they're trying to make it what the people are wanting to see, they don't know how to execute this. The developer talent pool that brought us Tekken in the arcades over all those years has dried up, and now we're dealing with a whole new set of people. Yes, maybe there's some familiar faces still hanging around, but obviously the people working on Tekken 8 now do not have that same foundation of how to design a game that Tekken once had. And even Harada's leadership certainly isn't helping. Because if you go back and look at Harada's tweet about the end of Soul Calibur and his assertion that gameplay mechanics are not the primary reason why a fighting game franchise succeeds or fails, during the era of Tekken 7 and even early Tekken 8, that tweet made some sense. And I remember everyone saying, yeah, okay, Harada, I see where you're coming from here. But in the light of Season 2, and just how damaged the gameplay mechanics have become, especially when he refers to this change away from focusing on gameplay mechanics as a paradigm shift. Now that reads really differently, like, whoa, Harada, gameplay mechanics are incredibly important. And now, go back and look at the end of Soul Calibur. The games just seem to get worse and worse, culminating in Soul Calibur 6. And here's something that's very interesting. If you look at Soul Calibur 6's reception in the way that Namco would look at it, the way that a mainstream type of person would look at it, Soul Calibur 6 was a slam dunk. Okay, it had great sales, it had great Steam reviews, it had great Metacritic scores. Soul Calibur 6 was a success if you're looking at it as a publisher. But if you actually played Soul Calibur 6, especially even slightly competitively, you would know that game was an abomination. It was definitely the predecessor to what we see happening here in Tekken 8 Season 2. The reversal edge mechanic is a literal rock, paper, and scissors added in to the game. And then there's a ton of meter and super spam. Soul Calibur 6 worked because the expectations in terms of game design were really low. all people wanted, and I bought Soul Calibur 6, were hot babes, a cool character customization, and some nostalgic type of fun. But no one actually expected Soul Calibur 6 to be a really viable competitive game. Didn't even have good net play. I had to use Parsec to play against my friends because the netcode was so bad. But it got away with it because of low expectations. This is the problem with seeing video games merely as products. Because as a product, Soul Calibur 6 did excellent. But in terms of a piece of game design, a piece of art, it was very shallow. And look at the drop off. Literally, people bought it, played it for a few days, and then never touched it again. Is that what we want to see happening with our fighting games? Because the style of design, this avenue that Harada is pointing to, that is where all of this is ultimately leading. And there are no counter incentives. Mainstream critics like IGN wouldn't be able to tell if a fighting game was good or not, even if they tried. So they just act as marketing wings for these publishers. And then on the influencer side of things, if you're dedicated to a fighting game as an influencer, its health and crowd size directly relates to your health and crowd size. So you want the fighting game to be as popular as possible. And then on the publisher side of things, having a robust, giant, casual interest audience, that's going to play out much better in the long term than trying to continually onboard people into this more complex style of game design, especially without the arcades to be the backbone economically. And then on Steam itself, usually the volume of casual players will drown out the descent of the smaller legacy hardcore players. And why does this matter, you may ask? Well, guess where the Soul Calibur devs ended up? That's right, in Tekken. We call this failing upward because even though they created an abomination in terms of their own series game design, because it succeeded commercially, now it is getting integrated into Tekken itself. Thank you, Harada. And yes, I'm aware of how much Backlash Season 2 is getting right now. This is definitely unprecedented in the world of fighting games because even if there is a release that radically shifts how the game is designed, look at Guilty Gear Strive, usually what ends up happening is the legacy players, they grumble and complain on Twitter for a while and on Discord, and there's a little bit of like a backlash to it, but ultimately the inpouring of casual fans outweigh them, and eventually they just quietly move on as if they never existed. So what is happening with Tekken 8 Season 2 and just Tekken 8 generally? Why isn't this transition as smooth as Namco probably would have hoped and a lot of other games have been able to achieve? It's hard to say for sure at this point, but I do have a theory that I think is pretty interesting, which is one reason why Tekken 8 cannot do this, where Guilty Gear Strive was able to pull this off, is because Tekken 7 was not just a game that people played for fun. It was a game that people spectated. It was a spectator esport. Very much like StarCraft Brood War. And I think this is actually what is happening to some degree with Tekken 8, where there are a lot of people, especially on console, who are just happy to spam their life away, and all of the shifts to Tekken 8 are making their lives the best they've ever experienced. When I was doing my 100 ranked matches, which I'll get to in a minute, I could sense the sheer joy radiating from some of these guys. So there is a demographic out there, I do think they exist, of dads who come home from work and they've got Tekken 8 on their PS5 and they fire it up with Harang and they just do kick string spam and 50-50s and juggles, and they're like, oh, okay, I won, I lost, and it's just kind of this mindless consumption and they probably spend most of their time doing custom character outfits than actually playing the game. I sense this is a big demographic that Namco are aware of, that the Twitter sphere and YouTube sphere probably aren't accounting for. Like if you look at the review scores for Tekken 8 on PSN as opposed to Steam, Steam is extremely negative and PSN is really positive. It's ironically even slightly higher than Tekken 7, just barely, but there you go. So this is the demographic that I think Namco are considering, and they're there. But there are a lot of people who love to watch high-level Tekken, and I think that player base, which Tekken 7 ironically did such a great job at capturing, is being fundamentally betrayed by Tekken 8. Because if you watch Tekken 8, it is just... it sucks. I didn't even enjoy watching it at EVO. I about took a nap because there's so little interaction. There's none of that spacing, that movement, those oh my god types of moments. When a game has 4 different comeback mechanics, comebacks are not hype. And so even though I am a fairly legacy player, that's not what Namco needs to worry about. They have awakened a sleeping giant that is going to cause them a lot more problems than just a few Tekken Tag Tournament players or Tekken 5 fans. I mean, they've awakened this own creature that they've created, which I find sort of funny in an ironic sort of sense, but also obviously really frustrating in the situation that we're in the middle of. But I just wanted to bring this up because I think the spectator crowd is a demographic that no one is taking into their analysis, Namco included. And speaking of analysis, I played over 100 ranked matches in Season 2, and here's what I have to report. Okay, coming into Season 2, because it's already widely acknowledged as being awful, and justifiably so, my goal for this section of the review was to try to find some nuance and try to identify some sort of coherent direction that these changes are adding up to. And I began with an interesting working theory, key on began, which was when you look at the patch notes and, like I said, dig into the bit of the developer history, you notice there's this Soul Calibur sleeper cell inside of Tekken 8. So maybe, my theory was, because they added foreground stepping, they're actually slowly transforming Tekken into Soul Calibur, which would be rude to the Tekken fans, but I do like Soul Calibur when it's good. So I thought, maybe this might be interesting. Let's give this a try. So the plan was I'm going to really try to take advantage of the foreground stepping and do something called step guard, which is sidestep into block. And the idea is because Soul Calibur either has A, linear attacks, or B, sweeping homing style of attacks. The linear attacks, obviously you step around them, and the homing attacks you step guard into. You step and block. And when you block, you're on frame advantage. So throwing out homing moves in Soul Calibur is dangerous to do because if they block them up close, they're going to throw you, they're going to mix you up. So I thought, maybe that's what they're going for here. But when you actually play Season 2, this doesn't work in the slightest because all of these giant homing ass attacks that they added in, they are advantaged on block. Anna's stupid hammer is +4. So I was getting into situations where I was pulling off these sick, perfect step guards and would go to jab punish, the lowest frame punish. I was getting counter hit out of it. So these giant ass homing attacks are nothing like Soul Calibur because Soul Calibur, when it was good, had some coherent frame data. Whereas these homing attacks just straight up shut down sidestepping. And so you can sidestep in Season 2. It is there, and it does happen, but just in terms of pure balance. The developers are either stupid or evil in deciding, nah, playa, homing moves will just hard shut down sidestepping. That's not going to work. Also, if you try to backdash out, because this game has so much forward-moving attacks, backdashing out, you're just getting caught in their little strings over and over. If you try to duck, well, here comes the mid. You know that mid launcher mix-up is coming. So trying to use spacing in Season 2 is actively taking risks that you shouldn't have to be taking. If you successfully sidestep something or successfully step guard into a homing move, you should be at advantage, not disadvantage. So just the pure balance of the spacing, it's nonsensical, but it's so commonly prevalent throughout all of the frame data changes that someone thinks this is a good idea or someone just does not understand how to balance a fighting game. Another example of this is the way they do the frame data on strings, because I've heard a lot of people describe Tekken 8 as aggressive. That, I think, is not being charitable to actually good aggressive games like Virtua Fighter. Tekken 8 isn't aggressive, it sucks. And I mean that in a purely technical sense, of course.
We reused an old God of War Ascension feature called Suck to Target on most of Kratos' attacks to help with this issue. Each attack specified a range, speed, and stop distance, which the engine would use to suck Kratos towards his target. This would make it significantly easier to hit enemies.
And what I mean by it sucks is that it's not that these spammers that you're fighting against are just these aggressive masterminds with all these sick mix-ups and they know how to press frame advantage and all that kind of thing. No, what it is Tekken 8 has a lot of suck to target mechanics where if they can just get the string out, then the momentum of the string will pull them into you. And there's not a really solid counterplay to this because obviously you're going to block this, and if the frame data of the game was somewhat good and coherent, what would happen is maybe you get them to whiff the first hit of their string, and then you'd block the second hit of their string, and when you block the second hit of their string, they'd be at frame disadvantage, and then you could punish that, sidestep around it, you could begin your counterplay. But because the strings in this game are so positive on block, just wildly swinging is actually a really effective way to play neutral in this version of the game, because block is good because you're healing, you're locking them down, you're pulling yourself closer to them, you're prepared to now do your mix-up, and this is the type of neutral game you see over and over again against these scrubs that I'm playing against here in the footage, and I'm trying so hard to play straight up Tekken, but this is viable. And that seems to be the guiding philosophy of how this game is balanced now. They want just the hardest reads possible. So if you're going to try to punish a guy's big linear string with a sidestep, you need to just hard read that they're going to continue to swing, because if you try to take a more measured sidestep and go into block, you're going to get clipped, or they're going to be able to reset the frame advantage. You have to actively say, all right, I'm taking this big sidestep, and you need to walk all the way around their string, and then you get a little bit of a punish. But if they decide just to stop swinging, that sidestep did nothing. And that is why it is just the spammer's paradise, because you don't need to worry about neutral game because you can constantly suck into the opponent. You can just skip neutral every single time and get right into the mix-up. And these spammers, they love this mini game of, oh, am I going for the low? Oh, am I going for the mid? Here's a mix-up command throw to put in there while we're at it. So effectively, what ends up happening is that technically, yes, you can sidestep around things, but because the game system is so permissive with throwing out homing moves and throwing out just endless strings, sidestepping is more risky now than it ever was before. And I talked about this in my tutorial video for Tekken, where an issue with Tekken's system, even historically, is that it tends to encourage spamming. But once you learn the movement and the sidestep mechanics, you're able to escape the spamming sand trap. And that's always sort of an uphill battle for the new Tekken player. Well, Tekken 8 Season 2, the sand trap is now just a death vortex black hole. You need to be a sidestepping grandmaster just to achieve an average level of success using stepping and movement in this version of Tekken. That's the hilarious part. Look at the footage here. I am trying so hard to play Fundamental Tekken. That was the goal, just to see how well it lines up into the new system. And what would happen is I would spend 4 matches just sweating my ass off, backdashing, sidewalking, sidestepping, step guarding, trying to just constantly make the fundamentals of the system work. And I would be able to just eke through about 4 matches. And then the 5th match, I would just get a little bit exhausted, and just the slightest error, the slightest not holding block for 5 minutes, and boom, it's over. You're dead. And the irony is, and I'm being 100% serious here, is if I got into a ranked match and a guy started sidewalking and backdashing, I would actually feel relief. Genuinely, I'd be like, he must have played Legacy Tekken, so he's not going to just spam the shit out of me with mix-ups and heat. We're going to actually try to play a little bit of Fundamental Tekken here. But the irony is, there's this interesting set of behavior that Tekken players will have, even ones that are trying to play more straight up, which is, okay, for the first 2 rounds, we'll try to play some genuine style of Tekken, but once that final round comes up and their rank is on the line, guess what comes out? Oh yes, the spam strings and the heat and the rage hearts and all of that. They're just sitting there waiting to engage it until they actually had to. But if you're trying to win, if you're trying to get your points, that is the style. It does become addictive, but not in the same way that Tekken used to be, of like, you're getting into the flow of the combat system and you're really like, oh, I'm learning, I'm starting to get it. This game is addictive in the rage spite sort of way. I don't think I've ever been this angry while playing a fighting game in a really long time, ever since I was a kid and throwing my controllers in Street Fighter 2. Everyone I played, I hated them. And that did create this sort of compulsive way of playing. And maybe that is part of this game's design and what they're trying to capitalize on. I talked about this a little bit in my previous video of how a lot of games now are intentionally introducing compulsive style design to keep you coming in, but not in a way that emphasizes skill, because skill hard stops this sort of compulsion, because you realize, oh, I have to learn, and there's all that friction involved there. Whereas if you just feel like, if I had only done the mid, if I'd only done the low, I would have won. And by reducing down all of the ambiguity of the combat system into that single point of focus, that creates this god damn it one more time type of behavior that is resistant to frustration, and it is resistant to you knowing that the game is meaningless and shallow. That's actually a part of its appeal. Look at slot machines. No one on earth thinks that slot machines are skill-based design, and yet people are compelled to continue to put money into them. But even with gambling game design, there are rules to this where it can't seem too downright arbitrary, because then the guy running the slots will realize it and realize, oh, you're just stealing my money. So there is even some nuance that a slot machine needs to have that I don't think Tekken 8 has. There's no nuance. They're going for this idea, but it's so poorly executed that now we can see what this thing is, where if it was more clever, maybe it would kind of get away with it. But because it's just this abomination, yeah, we can see right here. So I think it's important to document just how awful this design is and be aware of what devs are going to try to pull with this type of stuff in the future. But another thing I wanted to bring up is this game's chip system, as it's referred to. I don't think we should call it chip. We should call it spam heal. What this is a healing system that actively encourages spamming and actively disencourages small gradual hits over time. Because if you look at high-level Tekken or even moderate-level Tekken in the past, it's not just players going for constant launchers all day, every day. It's all about slowly whittling down your opponent's health through all of these strategic little wins where, oh, you get a low here, you get a jab here, small bits of damage that add up over time and end up putting more and more pressure on your opponent. And then under that pressure, then they start doing big swings and then comes the electric. That's the idea, is you slowly chip and whittle away at the opponent to open them up. But with this healing spamming system, now what ends up happening is that a blocked poke is no longer a neutral exchange health-wise. Getting attacks blocked is an advantage, not only because you are chipping away at their health, but you're also recovering your own health. So these neutral exchanges of just spacing and moving around, that is actively discouraged, not only with the nerfs to the movement system, but also with the incentives of hitting your enemy through the chip system. And so what ends up happening is the only way to do meaningful damage in this game is to go for the big launchers, to go for the big mix-ups. Again, they are doing everything they can with every system around every turn to disincentivize fundamental style Tekken. So not only does it skip neutral, not only does it put the opponent in this awful mix-up situation, but now it
heals you.
And I got all the way up to the end of the red ranks, and the types of playstyles I was dealing with should be day one level ranks. And the irony is that I actually had a really hard time advancing up in ranks because it was down to luck in a lot of cases with how the matches would work out, because you don't play players and you don't play characters in Season 2. What you play are block strings, and everyone has their little block string that they've mixed up and they've really formulated. And what ends up happening is, even if I end up winning the series, so I match up against the guy, the first match he obliterates me because I don't know what his block strings are. I don't know what his little mix-up game is. So I have to spend an entire game figuring this out, hard memo. So then I hard memo his block string, and then maybe I barely eke out a victory in our second match, and then he quits the third. Because he knows I know his block strings. And is that the game's fault? Well, I mean, maybe they should force best of threes at this point. But even if it's not directly the game's fault, it is very much overall the game's fault, because this is the mentality that Tekken 8 is encouraging. This is the mentality that Tekken 8 is catering directly to, with all of this gambling casino-style design that I'm really glad people have picked up on. That is creating this gambler's behavior even in the player base, where it's like, oh, this guy figured out my strings. I guess I'll just move on to the next guy. Let's see if he figures out my strings. It's a night at the slot machine for players, and it shocks me a little bit. I've been playing against Kazuyas who are purple ranked and cannot backdash cancel. The things that used to be really skill-based and, yes, broken, but broken in the sense that it took hundreds of hours to master their elements. Like, the reason why I play on Korean stick is because of Tekken, because I'm a Devil Jin player, that I want to do wave dashes and backdashing and the movement system that was so important to me, and I loved the way it felt on Korean stick, and now I play Korean stick always, even outside of Tekken. But that comes from playing Devil Jin Mishima. But in Tekken 8, the advantage of high execution movement is downright quaint when compared to just the madness of the heat system. Same thing with the armor attacks, by the way. Another reason why you can't play a poking and spacing game in this version of Tekken is your pokes are just going to get absorbed by armor attacks. And yes, I am aware that Tekken 7 also had Power Crush, but in the context of Tekken 8, where the opponent is constantly in your face and constantly swinging, the issues it creates with the neutral game are even more exaggerated. Especially since they can just spam heal themselves, the chip that you supposedly did, and then you're opening yourself up going for these little pokes and jabs to them using heat armor, which will just break through and they'll counter hit you there, or they'll just do a random rage art right through your pokes. So trying to poke at people, especially at the end of rounds, is super dangerous. There were so many rounds that I lost just trying to go for a traditional poking out style of kills. I get them down to that last sliver of health. Now you just go for a generic low kick and they'll through the generic low kick. And even if it doesn't kill you, they have the mix-up right on top of your ass and they'll activate heat. To close out a round, go for big-ass moves like a launcher or something like that. You need a move that will kill them even if they armor through it. Or you have to bait out something like a rage art or a heat activation. You have to take so many missed opportunities for Okazemi because it's just too risky to try to chip them out. The comeback mechanics of this game are absurd. They are so overwhelmingly good that at times it feels like you are at disadvantage for getting them into a rage art heat type of situation. I remember Street Fighter 4 Ultra had this type of problem, but this is Ultra on crack. It makes Ultra look downright balanced and tame. So yeah, even poking, end of round type of dynamics, those are out the window. Just go for strings. Just go for big launchers. Just spam. That's how you get the wins at the end of the rounds. It's really sad. And finally, let's talk about heat. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to do some research into the game design elements of Tekken 8 Season 2 because I was trying to find some sort of coherent direction where this game's mechanics are coming from. My initial hypothesis was Soul Calibur, and I think that was partly correct because clearly the heat engager little rock, paper, scissors comes from Reversal Edge, and Soul Calibur had a lot of this emphasis on meter and being spammy and kind of crappy, so you can see the influence from Soul Calibur, but there's even more to the story. And I think I did identify an additional source where this game's gameplay ideas are coming from, because I was looking through the Moby Games developer credits and I noticed there were a surprising amount of game developers in Tekken 8 that worked on Pokken. And I thought, that's odd. But there is a lot of arena-style elements to Tekken 8 Season 2, like the fact that all of your attacks are just homing in all the time and you're forced into these constant blocking situations. That's very arena fighters. Those don't have real spacing, sidestepping like a Tekken or Virtua Fighter. Instead, everything just auto homes in all the time. Suck to target. So that's very interesting. And you can see how both Pokken and Tekken 8 have a lot of mechanics that remove the neutral game spacing-wise, and why all of the strings are so positive on block. That seems to be a dynamic in Pokken as well. There's no high or low blocking in Pokken either. Maybe the guys working at Tekken 8 forgot about that whole dynamic. That could be a real source of where a lot of these complete misunderstandings of how neutral interactions in Tekken and frame data and all that should work are the guys working on the frame data literally thinking they're coding in Pokken style strings. Maybe. But then I started watching some Pokken matches because I was wanting to see what the neutral game would look like. And then I found it. I found the oh my god moment, which is Pokken has this mechanic called synergy. Heat is synergy. They are like the exact same systems. The heat system of Tekken 8 comes from Pokken.
There's a meter next to your HP bar called your synergy gauge. You gain meter by doing different actions. Some examples are whiffing or connecting with attacks, initiating a phase shift, taking damage, or armoring through attacks. Synergy by itself does not do anything, but when your gauge is full, pressing L plus R puts you into Synergy Burst or Burst Mode.
Burst Mode's activation is invincible on startup, so it can be used as a reversal.
Burst Mode gives you a 10% increase in attack and defense. All characters besides Chandelure gain specific changes like extra or better hitboxes and frame data on their attacks. Characters like Gengar and Lucario become drastically different and very difficult to stop. Lastly, Burst Mode recovers some of your gray life, and after a few seconds in Burst Mode without taking damage, you slowly gain back even more HP. Pressing L plus R while in Burst Mode does your Burst attack, or as I refer to it, your Super. These attacks are very powerful and gain invincibility or armor very early in the animation.
So there you go. The developers of Tekken 8 are not transforming the series into Soul Calibur. They're transforming the series into Pokken and into these arena fighters. And then you take a step back and it all makes sense because Look at Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, how big of a success that was. I can absolutely see the guys at Namco being like, oh, Project Tekken, get the Pokken guys in there. Is that actively happening like in smoky rooms? Who knows, but it's definitely effectively happening in how the game is developed. And there's been a lot of talk about the developers of Tekken 8, and so I did a little bit of research into that. And I think that is a very interesting situation in itself, because there's a lot of talk of, oh, maybe they should fire some guy or maybe replace some guy. But if you actually look on Moby Games, it's basically every developer in existence at Namco working on Tekken 8. It's not a situation where this is just one dude making all these decisions. Look at the roster. Look at how many dudes are just in the game design department of Tekken 8. And I started looking through them, and you get this crazy mishmash of, you got a few legacy Tekken guys in there, then you've got Soul Calibur Pokken guys in there, you've got random dudes, this is like their first game. It's just a giant crew battle of developers working on Tekken 8, and then it makes so much sense. Why is this game's design so schizophrenic? Why is it all over the place? Why is it saying one thing and doing another thing? It's because it's this giant committee of people trying to make this amalgamation. There has to be factions in the game design team itself, where you've got the sad old regular Tekken guys in there. They're getting bullied by the rest of the staff. They're getting swirlies in the toilet, and then Harada's tweeting, oh, it's not about game mechanics. It seems like pure chaos. And so the idea of, well, why don't they pull this together? Why don't they rein in on all of these dynamics with all this outcry and stuff like that? It's because there are probably people who their entire job is the chip system. And then there's probably another guy, his entire job is heat mechanics. And then there's another guy whose entire job is homing moves with plus frames. Obviously, I'm being a little rhetorical here, but you get the idea. That is why when you look at the changelog for Season 2, why it's this giant incoherent mess, because I bet what ended up happening is there's no clear direction, and then everyone's in their factions sort of working on things. So the guys in the heat corner are like, oh man, let's add this in, let's add this in. And then the plus frame homing guys are like, oh, let's put this in. And then they all come together, and there's this giant ass pile of changes everyone's proposing, and it's like Washington gridlock, who's getting in, who's not getting in. You're not going to back down on the heat system if your entire job is the heat system. They're not going to cut it. And they're not going to cut the chip. They're not going to cut all of these problems, where if it was a smaller team with one coherent vision that were holistically looking at everything, then one or two guys can change their mind. You could have one guy, he's looking at heat, it's not working, he can remove heat because he still has his job. But if you have this sort of segmented style of mechanical design, which I'm pretty sure is what's happening, dudes will not lose their jobs over this. They will fight to the death, especially given how these games are being evaluated by publishers. They're not evaluating them on the depth of their game design. We know Harada isn't, and I'm sure the higher-ups aren't doing that as well. They're just looking at, is it selling? Is it getting the metrics? And if it's hitting those, it's working. And so how can this be solved? I honestly have no idea, but I know it's a lot more complicated than just replacing a guy or two. It's going to take a real massive overhaul that is not the type of thing we tend to ever see in modern game design, even with really heavy public outcry. Remember, public outcry has a very short lifespan. Japanese developers are well aware of this. This is one of their strengths compared to Western developers. Like, they understand that public outcry cannot last that long. And so if they just huddle down and do a defensive curl, usually it ends up settling in the end, and people just kind of move on or accept it, and they've already made the sales. It's all good. And maybe this is kind of the last Tekken game of the foreseeable future. So maybe they're just trying to push it over the finish line, and long-term stuff about competitive blah, 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 maybe that's not even a concern anymore, because you look at what happened with StarCraft 2. A lot of developers are just bowing out. They're realizing this isn't making money. This really isn't contributing to sales like we think it once did. So maybe there is a bigger vision here that we're not privy to. which is maybe Namco are going to start stepping away from stuff like the Tekken World Tour, and this is a long-term play to get Tekken into that arena Dragon Ball Z sort of status that people will just buy it and play it casually. Who knows, but that would seem to be the direction that we're seeing. Maybe Tekken is genuinely trying to balance both sides of the audience, but because of the shift in the developing staff and the
paradigm shift,
as Harada puts it, in the post-arcade development philosophy, maybe they just do not have the understanding to create something that is both casually digestible and competitively deep. And maybe these are just two competing design philosophies that are not so easily merged together in an online rank environment, because in the past, where there wasn't online play, it was a lot easier to make a game that is both deep and accessible, like Tekken 5, because new casual players do not know that they're not good. They're not playing against top-level guys doing Korean backdashes and electrics and sidesteps. They're playing against their buddy next door and can't even backdash cancel. Whereas in the online environment, you learn very quickly, no, you are casual, you're not good. And so now developers have to somehow make a way, in their minds at least, that the casual scrub who cannot backdash cancel feels somehow a valid threat to the guy who's been playing for hundreds and hundreds of hours. Mission accomplished in Tekken 8, by the way. Is that legitimate? Is that good game design? I would say not, but that seems to be where we're treading. And since this giant crew of modern developers that are working on Tekken 8 are casuals themselves, that is definitely the bias they're going to lean towards. You can see this in pretty much all of the shifts they made to Season 2. And then on top of that, leaning towards the casuals also really is in the financial interest of the series. You can see all of these factors coming together to create this really shallow, homogenized abomination of what Tekken once was. And if shedding the demographic of legacy players is the price Namco has to pay, I'm thinking they're probably willing to pay it. Which puts Tekken as a series in a very interesting position, because if Namco pulled the plug on Tekken in a few years, what game would the player base choose as the definitive competitive Tekken game? Tekken 5? Tekken 6? It'd be interesting to see, especially because there aren't any PC ports of Tekken games besides Tekken 7. If you look like on Steam right now, Tekken 7, despite all the backlash against 8, isn't really that active, all things considered. But we've got a long way to go till that point, so I will continue to keep my eye on Tekken 8, but the current trend we're seeing is certainly concerning. So that's my review of Tekken 8 Season 2. It definitely sucks. The backlash is warranted. The only question is, will the backlash have much of an effect? I hope so, but I'm not super optimistic, to be honest. It has become a fascinating case study of game design gone wrong, so there is that silver lining, at least. And if you enjoyed this video, definitely check out my review of Virtua Fighter 5 Revo, which I think is a very strong counterpoint to what we're seeing with Tekken 8 right now. Not that I expect all the Tekken players or even that many Tekken players to transition over to Virtua Fighter, but if you are wanting a more fundamental style of fighting game, Virtua Fighter, at least for now, is still holding that down, and I very much enjoy it, so definitely check that out. So if you can, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and support me on Patreon. I'm a full-time YouTuber, and so Patreon is how this channel happens. So I'd very much appreciate any support on there. And there's lots of cool exclusive content as well. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons, 100 Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Alex, Alexander Pfeiffer, AMH, Anthony A, Arbin Gordon, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Aul Ali, Autoname, Battle Mode, Bo, Ben Foster, Benjamin Shabalski, Beto Dame, Foghog, Borgie22, Boston Crab, Brokeface, Brent Cox, Brian Lucy, Captain Rhodes, Chase Palumbo, Chaflip, Kristen SoCal, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Cipollino 0404, Clairvoyant Bongwater, Claricliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Cod Stop It, Concreted, Cooksand 666, Cook Some Soup, Choreo, Crew Expendable, CSP 3900, Des Audio, Damian Thorne, Dat Matei, Danshi, Darren Griffin, Dat Guy, David Aldris, David Crespo, Dididum, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Dio Domke, DJ 420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Duckies, Eduardo Akinta, Edvard, Elvin Senisev, Elias Alonso, Epson Eagle, Eric Shrivner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Lizama, Evan Serafet, Explosive General Games, Fabio Picci, Falcus, Fenich, Fiskin, Fiveside, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Gabriel Foreigner, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gelhoff, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk, Hans Kowalski, Hero Death, Holden, Holy, Han Harthy, Hud, Hugh Mungus, JDab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzua, Jay McCarthy, J67, JLab, JBRPG, Jeremy Kellner, Jink Hans, JMD, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slaylise, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Josh Mayer, Josie, JT, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, Keotune, Ken0082, Kill All Music, Contain, Craze the Boys, Kumawamu, Kai Arts, Kyrol, Leonardo McCoy, Wilberta, Luna Lilich, LZR Cuter, Macabre Monster, Mad Combaticus, Blaze, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Markman, Mason Polar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Maz, Mecha Roca, Minong, Meister, Menzrea, Mewjam, Michael Del Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Mig ZVM, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morag, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Miles P, Michigan, Naps91, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Nervous J, Nilfheim, Nogden, Okla Googles, Oleg Talmasev, Oregano Dog, Panzer Dragoon Should Have Been Arcade, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Pedro Montoya, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Guilon Yeager, R2 Sinus, Rafael Trujillo, Random, Randy Leahy, Raul VP, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Rent Halt's Time, Retro Man, Retro Schmupper, Riff Mason, Riff the Jacker, Robert Chang, Rory Starks, Rolf015, Running a Coup, Salmon Connections, San Nevo, Scanline City, Scott Ernicus, Seymour, Segfault, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Sirapong, Social Kid, Sophisticate Dead, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synthmilk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, Dana Oat, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The Catchu, The N1, The Old Bensta, The Smartest Billy, Tom McCarthy, Thomas Maddox, Tim French, TK Productions, Tom Faze, Travis Arbon, Tristan, Sugumo, Turam, 2IU, Twest Please, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Ursua, Ushimushi, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Wabby Legs, What Is This, William Miller, William Wallace, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Yosef Khalid, Yisperd, Zachary Patton, Zach, Zeal, Zenryoku, Zingus.